Hey guys, tonight we begin with the greasy, chaotic, and surprisingly addictive world of medieval junk food. You know the image. Medieval people eating serious, wholesome meals in great halls, hunched over trenchers of roasted meat. Everything very dignified and very brown, accurate. For about 12 people. The other several million were on the street, eating things fried in recycled fat by a man whose hygiene record was not being actively monitored by anyone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with something nobody asks, but everybody should. Did medieval people actually have junk food? The answer is yes, enthusiastically. And it was worse for you than anything currently available at a gas station. The medieval city, any city of significant size from London to Paris to Florence, was full of street food vendors, cookshop operators, pie sellers, fritter makers, wafer bakers, and roasted nut merchants, all competing for the coin of people who were hungry, in a hurry, or simply didn't have a kitchen, which was most people. The majority of urban residents in the medieval period lived in rented rooms or tenements with no cooking facilities. Not a small kitchen, no kitchen. A room with a bed and a floor and whatever you carried in with you. If you wanted hot food, you either bought it from someone who made it or you went without. The medieval street food industry existed because it had to, serving a population of people who needed to eat and had nowhere to cook. And it was everywhere. Medieval cities were loud and smelly, in ways the rural imagination doesn't quite capture, and a significant percentage of that smell was food. Meat roasting on spits over open fires, fat popping in iron pans, bread baking in communal ovens, whose heat leaked into the street. The sharp tang of vinegar used to preserve things, the sweet warmth of spiced pastry from the nearest cookshop. You couldn't walk through a medieval market without being offered food every 20 feet. Street vendors with portable equipment, baskets, small braziers, wooden frames slung from shoulder poles, competed for your attention with the kind of vocal marketing that preceded advertising by several centuries. The coals of the street sellers, the pie man, the wafer seller, the hot pea vendor, the woman with the basket of salted fish, were the soundtrack of the medieval city, the medieval equivalent of a notification sound, except louder and coming from multiple directions, and attached to an actual person who would follow you for half a block if you showed any interest. You are in a medieval city. Let's say London, which was the largest city in England by the 13th century and had a street food culture of sufficient density and complexity that it generated its own regulations, its own scandals, and its own specialized vocabulary. You've been walking since mid-morning. It is now somewhere around midday, which you know because the bells from the nearest church tower just rang out the hour in a way that left you approximately certain of the number. You are hungry, not desperately hungry, not the grinding hunger of the genuinely poor, just the ordinary midday hunger of a person who ate bread and ale this morning and has been moving around a city ever since. You have a few coins. You need food. You don't have a kitchen. You don't have time to sit in a tavern for a full meal. You need something hot, something fast, and something that will hold you until evening. You smell the cook shop before you see it. The smell is fat and smoke and meat and something sweet underneath, possibly the pastry, possibly something else that the fat has been cooking in long enough to absorb. The cookshop is a permanent establishment, unlike the mobile street vendors, a building with a hearth or several hearths, a long counter facing the street, and a production line running behind it that has been going since before dawn. The term cookshop in medieval English refers to establishments that sold cooked food ready to eat, the medieval equivalent of a takeaway restaurant, operating in every significant town and in great concentration in cities. London's Eastcheap was famous for its cookshops by the 14th century. The Argus map of London from 1561 shows the density of food retail in certain streets with a kind of proximity that suggests the operators were in direct and continuous competition with each other. Standing between two cookshops in Eastcheap, you were equidistant from two different versions of the same smell, making two different arguments for your coin. The product that defines the medieval cookshop more than anything else is the pie. Not the pie of your imagination, not the careful latticed thing from a bakery window. The medieval street pie. Hot, hand-sized, filled with whatever the cook had available that day. Wrapped in thick pastry that served as much as a container as a foodstuff. and sold for a price that the poorest city workers could manage on a good day. The pie is the original fast food. Portable, self-contained, no utensils required, and able to be eaten while walking, which in a medieval city where the streets were full of movement and the working day had no formal breaks, was not a minor convenience. It was the entire point. The pastry of a medieval street pie was not what you'd call short crust. It was a hot water pastry called a coffin, which tells you something about medieval attitudes to word choice, that the pastry shell of a pie was named after a casket. A coffin was thick, dense, tough enough to hold its contents, and survive being carried and handled without collapsing, and not particularly intended to be eaten in itself. It was a vessel. In wealthy households, the coffin was discarded after the filling was eaten, and the servants ate the pastry separately, or it was fed to the dogs, or it was given to the poor at the gate. In a street pie, bought by someone with no servants and no gate, the coffin was eaten too, because you had paid for it, and you were hungry, and pastry is pastry. It was not delicious. It was functional. It did its job. Inside the coffin was whatever the cook had, and here is where the medieval street pie enters territory that the modern food safety inspector would find distressing. The filling of a cookshop pie was governed by two principles: what was cheap and what was available. Meat was expensive, which meant the meat in a cheap street pie was the least desirable cuts, the scraps, the offal, the things the butcher couldn't sell through respectable channels. Kidney, liver, lung, tripe, the feet, the ears, the snout, the parts of an animal that have specific names, because they are specific parts with specific textures. All of these found their way into the filling of street pies. This was not unusual or scandalous by medieval standards. Organ meat was food. The nose-to-tail cooking that modern chefs discuss as a return to forgotten wisdom was simply medieval reality, driven not by philosophy, but by the economics of waste. The problem, and there was a documented problem, was freshness. Meat in a city without refrigeration spoiled in hours in warm weather and in a day or two in cold. The cookshop purchased its meat from butchers and sometimes from less official sources, and the freshness of that meat was a variable that the cook managed with whatever tools were available: salt, spice, vinegar, the heat of the cooking process itself, and in some cases the hope that the customer would be unable to identify the specific quality of what they were eating through the pastry. The records of medieval London city courts include regular prosecutions of cookshops for selling bad meat, specifically for selling meat that was rotten, that had been dressed with sauces and spices to disguise its condition, that had been recooked from previous days' leftovers, and in at least several documented cases, meat that was not what it was claimed to be. The medieval equivalent of the horse meat scandal was not a scandal. It was Tuesday. You take a pie from the counter. It cost you a halfpenny, which is about what you expected. The cook hands it over in the casual way of someone who has handed over several hundred of these today, and will hand over several hundred more before they stop. The pie is hot, which is excellent. The pastry is hard enough to require effort. You bite in. The filling is meat and something savoury, onion maybe, and something that has been cooked long enough to have lost most of its original characteristics and become simply filling. It is hot, and it is filling, and it does not taste of anything actively alarming. These are the only standards you are currently applying, and by these standards the pie passes. The fritter is the next thing you'll encounter, because a fritter seller has set up at the corner just past the cookshop, and the smell coming off her pan is the specific smell of deep fat frying that crosses centuries without alteration. That particular combination of hot oil and batter, that something primitive in the human sensory system interprets as promising regardless of what decade or century you are operating in. Fritters in the medieval period were made from anything that could be coated in batter and submerged in hot fat apples, most commonly cut into rounds and dipped in a batter of flour, egg, and sometimes ale, then fried until golden and crispy on the outside and soft inside. Apple fritters were popular enough to appear in multiple medieval recipe collections, and their presence in the street food landscape suggests they were the kind of thing that people bought habitually, the way you might buy a portion of chips today, as a hot sweet snack that made the afternoon slightly better, without requiring any further justification. But apples were not the limit. Fritters were made from pears, from elderflowers when they were in season, from sage leaves, from cheese cut into pieces, from fish in Lent, when meat was forbidden, from whatever soft thing could be battered and fried and sold at a price that made the exercise profitable. The fat used for frying was most commonly lard rendered pig fat, which was cheap and widely available and had a high smoke point suitable for frying. Good lard, fresh and clean, tasting produced excellent fritters. Old lard, used repeatedly without replacement, produced fritters that tasted of everything that had ever been fried in it, which by the end of a busy market day meant fritters with a complex and layered flavour profile that you could describe, charitably, as rustic. The oil was reused until it was exhausted, because fat was expensive, and waste was not a concept that the economics of street food could support. When it could vote, it went in the next batch of fritters. This was standard practice, and nobody found it remarkable. The apple fritter you buy is the good version, early in the day, the fat still relatively fresh, the apples tart and soft inside their batter shell, dusted with something that might be sugar if the vendor is prosperous enough to afford it, or simply the natural sweetness of the cooked apple if she isn't. It is hot enough that you have to hold it carefully, moving it between your hands as you walk, blowing on it before each bite. This is deeply familiar behaviour. The technology of the hot street snack has not fundamentally changed in 700 years. You are doing exactly what every person who bought a fritter from this woman has done, and what every person who buys something hot from a street vendor anywhere in the world has always done. Transferring the snack between hands, blowing on it, eating it too fast, because the smell has made patience impossible. Let's talk about the pie man specifically, because the ambulatory pie seller, the man or woman, who carries their wares through the street rather than operating from a fixed cookshop, is one of the most vivid figures in medieval urban life, and one of the most heavily regulated. The mobile food vendor was a feature of every medieval city and a headache for every municipal authority trying to control the quality and safety of the food supply. The fixed cookshop could be inspected. Its location was known, its operator was identifiable, its practices could be monitored, and its violations could be prosecuted with reasonable efficiency. The pie man who appeared at a market, sold his stock, and moved on before anyone got sick, was a considerably more difficult enforcement problem. Medieval London's regulations around food vendors ran to extraordinary detail. The Liber Albus, the city's administrative handbook compiled in the early 15th century, contains rules about who could sell food, where, when, at what price, and under what quality standards. The pie maker was required to use fresh meat. The baker was required to produce loaves of the weight and quality specified by the size of bread. The cookshop operator was prohibited from selling meat that had been kept beyond safe storage, from using offal dressed to look like better meat, and from various other practices that the records of prosecution tell you are happening, continuously anyway. The regulations and the violations existed in permanent creative tension, each generating the other, the regulations becoming more specific in response to the violations they failed to prevent. The gingerbread seller at the fair deserves a moment, because gingerbread is one of the most interesting foods in the medieval street food landscape, existing at the intersection of the medicinal, the culinary, and the purely pleasurable, in a way that medieval food frequently did. Gingerbread in the medieval period was not cake. It was not the soft molasses, dense loaf of modern gingerbread, not the spiced biscuit of Christmas tradition. It was something older and stranger, a confection of breadcrumbs, honey or sugar, and a mixture of spices including ginger, cinnamon, pepper, and sometimes saffron, combined and pressed into moulds, and sometimes gilded with actual gold leaf. The result was dense, sweet, intensely spiced, and more like a candy than a pastry. It was sold at fairs and markets from boards and baskets, shaped into figures and letters and heraldic devices, decorated with cloves pressed into the surface for additional flavour and visual effect. The gingerbread sold at a medieval fair was not cheap. The spices in it were expensive, the honey or sugar was expensive, and the gold leaf on the premium versions was genuinely gold. This was not the gingerbread of daily life. It was the gingerbread of special occasions, the annual fair, the Saint's Day market. The moment when you had a coin you didn't strictly need for survival, and you spent it on something that would taste unlike anything else you ate all year. The spice hit of medieval gingerbread, the intensity of ginger and pepper and cinnamon working together in a dense sweet medium, would have been genuinely extraordinary to a palate accustomed to plain bread and pottage. It was the medieval equivalent of something from a specialty chocolate shop, expensive, exotic, worth the money in the specific sense of being an experience, rather than merely a meal. You pick up a piece at the fair stall, it is harder than you expected, the breadcrumb base giving it a density that requires actual chewing. The ginger is immediate and strong, followed by the cinnamon and pepper working underneath it. The honey sweetness comes last, slowing everything down and smoothing the spice edges. It is not subtle. Medieval food, despite its reputation for blandness in popular imagination, was not subtle when it had access to ingredients. When spices were available, they were used generously, the medieval cook's philosophy being that the purpose of flavouring was to flavour, not to hint in the direction of flavour, and hope the diner completed the sentence. The gingerbread is saying something clearly and at full volume. You eat the whole piece standing at the stall and consider buying another, which is exactly the response the seller was counting on. The wafer is a different category of sweet street food, lighter and crispier, and more elegant than gingerbread in its construction, if not necessarily in its ingredients. Wafers were thin, crispy, often flavoured with anise or other spices, cooked between hinged iron plates over a fire in a process that is recognisable as the ancestor of both the modern waffle and the ice cream cone. The wafer iron, a flat hinge device that clamped the batter between two patterned plates and cooked it thin and crispy in minutes, was one of the standard pieces of equipment for the waferer, the specialist in wafer production who travelled fairs and markets with his iron and his supply of batter and sold his output hot from the press. The waferer was a recognised trade. In London by the 14th century, there were enough waferers operating to warrant inclusion in guild records and city regulations. The product was popular and versatile. Savoury wafers made with cheese were served at the end of meals in wealthy households to aid digestion, which was a medieval medical theory that has not aged particularly well but generated considerable wafer consumption among the nobility. Sweet wafers made with sugar or honey and spice were sold at markets and fairs to everyone who could afford them. The wafer fresh from the iron, thin and translucent at the edges, slightly thicker in the patterned centre, hot enough to require a moment of cautious handling before the first bite, was one of the best things available on a medieval street. Crispy, light, fragrant with whatever spice the wayfarer had added to the batter. Gone in 3 or 4 bites, and immediately missed. Let's talk about roasted chestnuts, because they are one of the simplest and most universal of street foods, and the medieval city had them in quantity. Chestnuts were a significant food crop in medieval Europe, particularly in areas like southern France, Italy, and Spain, where the sweet chestnut tree grew abundantly, but also available through trade in northern markets. Roasted over a small fire, or brazier, split to allow steam to escape, sold in paper or cloth by the handful. Chestnuts were cheap, hot, filling, and required no preparation beyond the roasting. The roasted chestnut vendor was a fixture of autumn and winter markets in any city near a supply of the nuts. You bought them in your cap or in a cloth too hot to hold, but producing warmth through the fabric, and you ate them standing in the cold with the specific pleasure of a hot thing in a cold context. Chestnuts could also be dried and ground into flour, making them a significant caloric resource in regions where grain was scarce or expensive. Chestnut bread, chestnut porridge, chestnut soup, in the mountainous regions of southern Europe, where wheat struggled to grow at altitude. The chestnut was the dietary backbone of entire communities. The roasted chestnut sold on the street was the luxury end of a food source that could, at the other end of the economic scale, be the difference between a household getting through winter or not. You eat the street chestnut without thinking about this because you are a city person with access to multiple food options, and the chestnut is a pleasant snack rather than a survival strategy. The woman selling them from the brazier at the market corner sells them in whatever quantities you want, and they are exactly as good as advertised. The herring. Let's talk about the herring, because it is the junk food of the medieval poor in a way that deserves serious attention. Salted herring, smoked herring, dried herring, herring in various states of preservation and various degrees of edibility. These were the cheapest protein available in most of medieval northern Europe, and they were omnipresent on the streets and in the markets of every city within reach of the sea, which in England, France, the Low Countries, and the German coastal cities was most of them. The North Sea herring fishery in the medieval period was one of the largest commercial enterprises in Europe, an industry that involved thousands of fishing boats, complex processing operations on the Dutch and English coasts, and a trading network that distributed the preserved fish inland for hundreds of miles. A salted herring cost almost nothing, less than a farthing in many medieval English markets, meaning it was within reach even of the genuinely poor, the day labourer, the beggar with a coin, the person who had almost no money and needed something that was technically food. It was not delicious. Salted herring, sold from barrels on the street, was dense with salt, intensely fishy, and almost impossibly preserved in a way that allowed it to be transported long distances without refrigeration and stored for months without spoiling. You ate it with bread if you had bread, and without if you didn't. You ate it when meat was too expensive and pottage was unavailable, and you needed to put something in your body that would sustain it through the afternoon. It was functional food in the most elemental sense, and its presence at the cheap end of every medieval food market tells you something about the economic reality of urban life. The smoked herring, specifically the red herring, was a more processed and more flavourful version, herring cured in salt and cold. Smoked for weeks until it turned reddish, brown, and developed a flavour that was simultaneously intense, meaty, and deeply pungent in a way that divided opinion along lines that had less to do with taste than with whether you had grown up eating it. The phrase red herring as a way to describe a misleading distraction comes from the practice of dragging a smoked herring across a trail to confuse hunting dogs, which tells you something about the smell of the thing, powerful enough to override the scent of a fox, which is itself not a subtle smell. Alongside the herring was stockfish, dried cod that had been preserved without salt by air, drying in the cold, clear air of northern Norway and Iceland, and exported throughout medieval Europe in quantities that suggest it was even more widely traded than salted herring. Stockfish was almost impossibly hard in its dried state, literally as hard as wood, requiring hours of soaking and beating before it became edible. The preparation process was not glamorous. You soaked the stockfish, you beat it with a mallet, you soaked it more, you boiled it, and eventually you had something that was softened enough to eat, in a stew or with butter, or simply with whatever was available. The result, when properly prepared, was actually good, mild, flaky, clean, tasting, and filling in the way that only substantial protein can fill you. The problem was the preparation time, which in a street food context was not available. Stockfish was not a street food in its final form. It was a raw ingredient that you took home and turned into food over the course of a day, which in a city full of people with no kitchens created a specific problem that various food vendors tried to solve by selling pre-soaked, pre-cooked stockfish dishes from their stalls. The mustard cellar at the corner is worth stopping for, because mustard in the medieval period was not a condiment in the secondary sense of something added to an already complete food. It was central. Medieval mustard was made fresh, ground from mustard seeds and mixed with verjuice. That sharp liquid made from unripe grapes, or crab apples that served as the medieval equivalent of vinegar, or with wine, or with ale, to produce a condiment that was sharp, pungent, and capable of improving almost any protein it came into contact with. The mustard seller ground and mixed her product fresh, selling it in small clay pots or in portions wrapped in leaves, and it was purchased by people who had bought street meat or fish and needed something to make it interesting. The combination of salt, preserved fish, and sharp fresh mustard was, and remains, genuinely excellent. Medieval people had good palates for this combination and used it constantly. Let's get into the cookshop more deeply, because it is the most important institution in the medieval street food landscape, and it operated on a scale and complexity that deserves proper attention. A well-established London cookshop in the 14th century was running multiple fires simultaneously, maintaining different cooking operations in parallel: a spit for roasting, a cauldron for boiling, pans for frying, an oven for pastry. The variety of output from a single establishment could be considerable: roasted meat by the portion or by the joint, boiled pottage in bowls, pies of various sizes and fillings, fried pastries, sauces and condiments, and sometimes sweets depending on the occasion and the operator's ambition. The cookshop also provided a service that the medieval kitchen economy depended on: communal baking. In dense urban neighbourhoods where individual households had no ovens, the cookshop or the nearby baker's oven was where people brought their prepared food to be cooked. You made your pie at home, assembled the filling and the pastry in your room, or at a table wherever you lived, and then you carried it to the nearest available oven, paid a small fee, and collected it when it was done. The product was yours, the production was communal, and the resulting arrangement was a kind of outsourced kitchen that served the majority of urban residents who had none of the equipment required for baked or roasted food. This practice, common in medieval cities, persisted in dense urban neighbourhoods in some parts of the world into the modern period. The cook who ran this operation, specifically the professional cook working in a large cookshop or tavern rather than the domestic cook of a household, was a skilled tradesperson whose expertise was genuine and whose knowledge of timing, temperature, seasoning, and the specific requirements of different cuts and ingredients was developed through years of practice. Medieval recipe manuscripts, and there are several dozen significant surviving examples from the 14th and 15th centuries, represent the upper end of medieval cooking knowledge: complex preparations involving multiple techniques, expensive ingredients, and the kind of presentation that implied a professional setting. The form of curry, compiled by the master cooks of Richard II in the 1390s, contains nearly 200 recipes for a royal kitchen. The Harleian manuscript 279 and 4016 contain recipes for the kitchens of the prosperous. These are not the recipes of the street food cook whose output was simpler and whose operating conditions were less controlled, but they represent the context in which medieval food knowledge existed, and the skills that filtered down from the elaborate professional kitchen to the street. Level cookshop were real skills, applied to cheaper ingredients under harder conditions. The pie that went wrong deserves its own moment, because medieval street pies went wrong with enough frequency to generate an entire regulatory apparatus and a specific category of court cases. The combination of cheap meat, imperfect preservation, imperfect cooking, and the fundamental inability of the consumer to inspect the inside of a pie before purchasing it created conditions for food fraud that were exploited consistently and creatively. Stale meat dressed with spice, old pies reheated and sold as fresh, pies filled with the least desirable animal parts, or with parts not clearly identifiable as coming from any particular animal. A court case from 14th century London documents the seizure of pies made from a filling that included material. The court record describes with the careful disgust of official language, trying to communicate something unacceptable in neutral terms. The pies were burned in the street. The maker was fined. Similar cases appear throughout the medieval record, with the regularity of a phenomenon that was being prosecuted, not eliminated. You don't know any of this as you eat your cookshop pie on the street. You don't have access to the court records. What you have is a hot pie that is doing its job of filling you up, and a reasonable faith that the cook down the street, who has been operating for years and whose customers keep returning, is managing the quality of her product well enough to sustain the business. This faith is mostly warranted. Most medieval street food was what it was sold as, most of the time produced by operators who understood that their reputation was their business, and that sick customers were bad for trade. The egregious violations that made it into the court records were real, but were not the daily reality of the majority of cookshops. This is roughly the same calculation you make every time you buy food from any source in any century. The statistical probability of it being fine is high. The consequences of it not being fine are bounded, and the hunger is immediate. You proceed accordingly. Salted peas, hot from a pot on the street, deserve acknowledgement, because they were among the simplest and most available of medieval street foods, and because they represent a category of food that is both humble and genuinely good. Dried peas, soaked and boiled until soft and seasoned with salt, and sometimes with herbs, sold by the bowl or the cup, were the cheapest hot food available in a medieval city on most days. They were thick, filling, vaguely sweet in the way of legumes, and produced a specific satisfaction that comes from eating something simple that has been properly prepared. Hot salted peas from a street vendor were, and are in various forms, one of the most reliable of cheap urban foods. The medieval poor ate them constantly. The medieval prosperous ate them in Lent when meat was forbidden. The medieval sick ate them as an easily digestible source of nutrition. Hot peas throughout the medieval period, and well beyond, were a foundational element of the diet of people who didn't have much money and needed something that would hold them through the day. The chestnut vendor we met earlier is now selling something else, because it is later in the day, and the chestnuts are gone. What she has now is walnuts, cracked and sold by the handful, and a basket of dried figs that travelled here from somewhere in the Mediterranean, along a trade route that has been moving dried fruit into northern Europe since the Roman period. Dried figs are sweet and dense and intensely flavoured, nothing like the fresh fig that you could only find in the south. They have concentrated in the drying process, all their sugar trapped and intensified, and they are genuinely excellent food, small and portable, and lasting in a way that most medieval food did not. They were expensive enough to be a luxury for ordinary people, but cheap enough to appear at market stalls alongside the salted herring, and the day labour bread, because the Mediterranean trade routes were efficient enough to move them north in quantity. The eel pie. London and eels have a relationship that goes back before memory, and extends to the present in the form of the jellied eel, which is the direct descendant of medieval eel preparation, modified by time, but recognisable in essence. The Thames in the medieval period was full of eels. Eels were cheap, abundant, and considered entirely acceptable food across all social levels, from the peasant who fished them from the river to the bishop who ate them in elaborate preparations at his table. The eel pie sold by street vendors in medieval London was a humbler version of these elaborate preparations. eel cooked in a pastry coffin with whatever seasonings were available, sold hot from the cook shop, and eaten with the same casual efficiency as any other pie. The taste of eel is distinctive, oily and slightly muddy in a way that either works for you or doesn't, and the medieval eater who grew up with it regarded it as normal food, in the way that you regard normal food as normal food without question, without consideration, simply as what was available and what was good. A note on Lent, because Lent reorganized the entire medieval street food landscape for 40 days every year, in ways that were both legally enforced and commercially significant. Lent was the period of fasting and abstinence before Easter, during which the consumption of meat was prohibited for observant Christians, which in medieval Europe meant essentially everyone who didn't want to have a difficult conversation with their local priest. For 40 days, the cookshops of every medieval city shifted their production. The spit went cold. The pies changed their fillings from meat to fish, from pork to herring, from game to stockfish. The fritter sellers switched from meat, based to fish, based or vegetable, based options. The demand for preserved fish, already high year round, increased sharply, and the price of herring and stockfish went up accordingly. The Lenten menu was not limited or miserable, it was just different. And within the constraint of no meat, the medieval cook found considerable room for variety and creativity. Fish pies with elaborate spiced sauces, fritters of vegetables and cheese. Almond milk used in place of dairy milk in dishes, where dairy milk was also technically abstained from by stricter observers. The medieval almond milk was not the watery modern product, but a rich, creamy liquid made from ground almonds and water, capable of producing a credible substitute for dairy in most cooking applications. And it was produced in enormous quantities during Lent by every kitchen from the grandest to the most modest. The street food stalls of Lent reflected this: lighter, fishier, more vegetable, forward and selling, at the better end of the market, some genuinely interesting products that existed, specifically because 40 days without meat every year created a market for creativity in non-meat cooking that wouldn't otherwise have existed. The fair. The medieval fair was the pinnacle of the street food experience. The concentration of everything the normal market had scattered across multiple days, and neighbourhoods into a single event of several days, or a week, drawing food vendors from a wider radius and customers from a wider area, and creating an atmosphere of festive consumption that suspended the ordinary logic of careful spending. The great fairs of medieval Europe, Stourbridge Fair near Cambridge, the Champagne Fairs in France, the Bartholomew Fair in London, were economic events of enormous significance, places where international trade happened, and where the ordinary person ate things they couldn't get any other time. The fair vendor who appeared once a year with a specialty product could charge a premium that the everyday market wouldn't support, because the fair customer had come specifically for an unusual experience, and had budgeted psychologically for spending more than usual. At Bartholomew Fair, held annually in August in Smithfield, the roast pig was the signature food, so central to the fair's identity that Ben Jonson's 1614 play about the fair is named after it, and the association between this fair and roasted pork goes back to the medieval period. A whole pig roasted over an open fire, sold by the portion, the fat dripping and smoking, and producing the smell that marketing departments would sell to you forever, if they could bottle it, was the kind of food that existed on the far edge of the ordinary medieval diet. Not because pork was unusual, but because a whole pig roasted in public for a crowd of fairgoers was a festive version of food, abundant and theatrical and celebratory, in a way that the halfpenny herring on the street corner was not. The fair pig was an event. You paid for it not just because you were hungry, but because you were there, and being there meant eating this, because this was what the fair was for. Let's slow down and consider what all of these foods have in common, because the commonality is not obvious, but it is important. Medieval street food and medieval junk food were, most of them, not the result of abundance. They were the result of scarcity applied creatively. The pie that used offal because good cuts were too expensive. The fritter that was apple, because fruit was cheaper than meat. The herring that cost a farthing because it had to cost a farthing for the people who needed it to be able to eat. The resources available to the medieval street food vendor were limited in ways that make the ingenuity of the output more impressive, not less. You could not simply buy good ingredients and cook them. You had to make good food from what was available, at a price that the majority of customers could afford, using equipment that was minimal and techniques that had to be fast and reliable, because the street did not offer the luxury of extended preparation time. This constraint produced genuine creativity. The medieval spiced pie, the heavily seasoned stew, the strongly flavoured fritter. These were not just survival food. They were good food within the parameters of what was possible, developed over generations of people, figuring out how to make the cheap and available taste like something worth eating. The spice that masked the age of the meat also added flavour that was genuinely valued. The deep frying that made cheap batter into something crispy and satisfying was a real culinary technology. The preservation techniques that kept herring edible for months were not a compromise with fresh fish, but the creation of a different food with its own character and its own appropriate uses. The sugar. We need to talk about sugar, because it entered the medieval street food landscape as it entered the medieval economy generally, slowly, expensively, and with a transformative effect that the people living through it didn't have the distance to fully appreciate. Sugarcane cultivation in the Middle East and the Mediterranean had been producing sugar available for import into northern Europe since the early medieval period. But until the 13th and 14th centuries, refined sugar was so expensive that it was essentially a spice, kept in locked boxes and used in tiny quantities in the most expensive cooking. It was a medicine prescribed by physicians as a preservative and a corrective to various imbalances. It was a luxury so luxurious that a small quantity of it could be a meaningful gift. As trade routes expanded and production increased, the price of sugar began to fall. Not quickly, not to anything approaching modern availability, but enough that by the late 14th century, sugar was accessible to urban middle-class buyers in ways that it hadn't been before, and by the 15th century it was appearing in street food contexts that would have been impossible a century earlier. The sugar work of the late medieval period, elaborate confections of sugar, sculpted and coloured and presented as table decorations for wealthy banquets, trickled down into the street food market as simpler sweets, sugar-coated spice seeds called comfits. Sold by the handful from paper bags at markets and fairs, small hard sugar candies flavoured with ginger or cinnamon, and eventually, in the more prosperous markets, early forms of confectionery that the modern eye would recognise as proto-candy. Comfits deserve special attention because they represent one of the clearest lines of descent from medieval street food to modern candy. A comfit was a spice seed, caraway, anise, fennel, coriander, coated in successive layers of dissolved sugar that built up over many applications into a smooth, hard, round sweet. The process was labour-intensive, requiring hours of careful sugar application in a rotating pan to build up the layers evenly without the seeds clumping together, and it produced a product that was shelf-stable, portable, and genuinely delicious in the way of a good hard candy, the initial sugar sweetness giving way to the aromatic seed inside. Comfits were sold by the small bag or the handful at fairs and markets, given as gifts, used medicinally as digestive aids, and eaten for pleasure by anyone who could afford them. The spice seeds that served as the centres of comfits were themselves considered medicinal in the medieval framework. Seeds like caraway and anise and fennel being used to aid digestion and prevent flatulence in a diet heavy in beans and legumes, which were notorious in medieval medicine for producing what the texts called windiness. The comfit therefore occupied an interesting position, pleasurable enough to be bought for pleasure, medicinal enough to be justified on health grounds, small enough to be eaten casually, and sweet enough to be a genuine treat in a world where sweetness was not available on demand. The sugar in a comfit was real sugar, expensive to produce, valuable enough to be used carefully. The person who bought a small bag of comfits at the fair was buying something that felt like a luxury, because it was, actually, a small luxury, and medieval people were not above small luxuries any more than people of any other century. The marchpane, which you know as marzipan, appears in the late medieval sweet food landscape as the premium luxury confection of the period, made from ground almonds and sugar worked into a paste that could be moulded, coloured, and gilded to produce elaborate shapes that were as much sculpture as food. Marchpane was expensive because almonds were expensive, sugar was expensive, and the skill required to produce the elaborate moulded versions demanded from the wealthy was genuine craft. The street food version of marchpane was simpler, small tablets or fingers of almond and sugar paste, modestly decorated, sold at fairs and markets at prices that put them at the high end of affordable treats rather than in the luxury category. They were better than the comfits and worse than the elaborate Guildhall centerpieces, which is the position that most of the best things in life occupy. You find a marchpane seller at the fair stall near the spice merchant, and you buy 2 small tablets because the price is high enough to make one seem insufficient, but low enough to allow 2 without serious guilt. The texture is dense and yielding, neither hard nor soft, but something in between, and the flavour is intensely sweet and almond, the sugar and the nut inseparable in the final product. This is not subtle food. It is sweet in the maximum way available in the 14th century, and if you have been eating plain bread and salted fish all week, which is the baseline diet of most urban workers, the marchpane lands with a clarity and intensity that is almost architectural. It is telling you something about sweetness that you have temporarily forgotten, and you stand at the fair stall eating 2 small tablets of marzipan and understanding, without articulating it, why sugar changed the world. The pancake seller is working near the south end of the market, her brazier throwing a circle of warmth that draws a small crowd. Medieval pancakes were thin, fried in butter or lard, and served with whatever was available. Honey, sugar for those who could afford it, fruit compote, or simply rolled plain and eaten hot. Pancake Tuesday, Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent began, was one of the great occasions for pancake eating in medieval Europe, the day when households used up the fat and eggs that couldn't be consumed during the Lenten fast by cooking as many pancakes as possible, and eating them until no more could reasonably be eaten. The ceremonial quality of this practice, the church calendar, organising the food calendar, creating a day that was defined by the consumption of a specific food, is one of the clearest examples of how medieval religious observance and culinary practice were interwoven in ways that neither could entirely separate. But pancakes were not only a Shrove Tuesday food, they were a year-round street food item, quick to make, cheap in ingredients, and satisfying in the way of hot fried carbohydrate, with a topping of something sweet. The pancake seller with her brazier and her batter was a standard presence at markets and fairs throughout the year, and her product was eaten by people who needed lunch fast, and people who wanted a sweet end to a savoury market visit, and people who simply smelled the butter frying and made a decision they hadn't planned to make. This is the fundamental truth of street food in any century. It meets you where you are, smells better than your willpower, and gets eaten before the cost. Benefit analysis is complete. The preserved fruit sold at market stalls, alongside the fresh seasonal fruit that appeared in summer, occupies a category between snack and sweetmeat that the medieval food system used extensively. Fruits were preserved in honey, in sugar for those who could afford it, and through drying, which concentrated their flavour and sweetness into something that was more intensely fruit, tasting, than the original fresh product. Dried plums, dried apricots from the south, dried figs already mentioned, preserved cherries and pears. These were sold from baskets and jars at stalls alongside the fresh produce, and they served both as food and as flavouring agents for cooking. A dried fig bought on the street was an immediate sweet snack. The same fig bought in quantity was a cooking ingredient. The medieval food economy made no distinction between these uses, and neither did the people who bought. The hot spiced wine, if we can extend our definition of junk food to include beverages, was the medieval equivalent of a specialty seasonal drink, sold from heated pots at winter markets and fairs, with the specific function of being both warming and pleasurable, in ways that regular cold ale was not during a November market day. Hippocras, the spiced wine we mentioned earlier, was not just a remedy for bad wine. It was a drink with its own identity and its own pleasure, sweet and aromatic and warm. A cup of which on a cold market day was exactly what the combination of cold air and available funds suggested. The spices in Hippocras, cinnamon and ginger primarily, had warming properties attributed to them by medieval medicine that were at least partly validated by the physiological experience of drinking them, the ginger producing actual warmth in the body, the cinnamon contributing aromatic depth, the wine providing everything else. The sausage, medieval street sausages deserve their moment, though the moment is somewhat complicated by what they contained, and by the regulatory environment in which they were produced. Sausage, making use the parts of the animal that couldn't be sold in any other form, stuffed into cleaned intestine casings, and seasoned with whatever combination of herbs and spices the maker preferred or had available. The result was a product that was, at its best, excellent, savoury, dense, full of the flavour that only well-seasoned ground meat produces, especially when cooked over an open fire until the casing is crispy and the interior is just cooked through. Street sausages from a vendor, with a good supply of fresh meat and sound spicing, were genuinely delicious food that served the function of providing concentrated protein in a portable and satisfying form. At its worst, the medieval sausage was the vehicle for every ingredient that couldn't be sold any other way, seasoned so heavily that the original ingredients were identifiable only by texture and not by flavour, cooked over whatever fire was available for however long was convenient, and sold to whoever was hungry enough not to ask questions. The court records here are illuminating. Prosecutions for sausages containing ingredients that the sausage maker was not authorized to sell. For sausages made from animals that had died of disease rather than been slaughtered. For sausages in which the meat content was supplemented with fillers of various types. The medieval sausage was, in short, the medieval equivalent of the mystery hot dog. Probably fine. Almost certainly not exactly what it claimed to be. Eaten because it was hot and it was there, and hunger made the details negotiable. The bread roll sold on the street corner, the manchet, deserves acknowledgement as the baseline street food of the medieval period. The thing that was always available, always edible, and always serving as both a food in itself and the vehicle for everything else. The manchet was a small, round, individually sized white or near white bread roll, made from better quality flour than the dark everyday loaf. And it was the bread of people who could afford slightly more than the baseline. Sold warm from the baker's basket, the manchet was eaten plain with butter, if you had it, with cheese from the market, with a sauce from a street meat purchase, or as the sponge to soak up the broth from a bowl of pottage. It was not exciting food. It was comfortable food, the reliable constant, against which everything more interesting was measured. The flat bread of the ordinary was the trencher, a thick slice of several-day-old bread that in wealthy households served as a plate, absorbing the sauces and drippings of the food placed on it, and then being eaten or given away as charity at the end of the meal. In the street food context, the trencher was not a plate, but simply a foundation. You bought your roast meat, or your herring, or your pottage, and you had your bread, and the combination produced a complete, if simple, meal. The trencher in this context was the original wrap, the original carrier, cheap, edible, and functional enough that its use as a container was considered completely normal, rather than improvised. Let's talk about the drinking that accompanied all of this eating, because medieval street food and medieval street drinking were inseparable in ways that reflect both the safety concerns about water and the social culture of eating and drinking together. Ale was sold from barrels on the street alongside food, not just in taverns, and the street vendor who sold food often sold drink as well, or operated in close proximity to someone who did. The combination of a hot pie and a cup of ale from the nearest barrel was the complete medieval street meal, the original combo deal, and it cost less than any restaurant meal in any modern city, and sustained people through working days that were considerably more physically demanding than most modern equivalents. The lemonade cellar does not exist in medieval England because lemons are expensive, and sugar is expensive, and combining them into a street beverage for the general public is not economically viable until considerably later. What exists in her place is the cold fruit infusion, herbs and fruit steeped in cold water and sold from a jug at markets during summer, and the hot version in winter, and the small beer, which is a very weak fermented drink made from the leftover grain after stronger ale is brewed. So low in alcohol as to be essentially alcohol-free, sold cheaply and consumed in large quantities as a hydrating beverage that was safer than plain water. You are standing in the middle of this medieval food market. Now, the full sensory experience of it, the smells and sounds, and the press of people moving through the stalls. The pie seller to your left, the fritter maker whose oil is starting to smoke slightly, the gingerbread from the spice end of the market, the fish stall with its baskets of salted herring and its cold, salt, sea smell cutting through the warm food. Smells like a correction. People are moving through the stalls with the focused attention of consumers who know what they want and how much they have to spend, and are not browsing for pleasure, but shopping for necessity. The fair customer has a different energy, more expansive, more willing to be surprised, following the smell of the roasting pig, with a specific walk of someone who has decided to enjoy something. The market regular has the efficiency of repetition, going to the stalls they always go to and buying what they always buy. The transaction brief and mutually understood. This is the medieval junk food landscape in full operation. It is not clean. It is not regulated in any way that would satisfy a modern health inspector. Some of what is being sold is exactly what it claims to be. Some of it is a creative interpretation. All of it exists because people need to eat, and eating on the move in a medieval city required this infrastructure of hot food, fast food, portable food, and cheap food that grew around the demand for it as naturally as weeds grow around a garden. The cook who stands behind her counter calculating how to use yesterday's leftover meat tomorrow, the pie man who knows which spice makes old filling taste. Fresh, the fritter seller who stretches her batter with water when the flour gets expensive. They are all doing what every food business in every century has done, which is finding the intersection of what is available and what people will pay for, and operating there as sustainably as the market allows. You buy one more thing before you leave the market. At a stall near the exit, a woman is selling what she calls comfits, small sugar, coated seeds in a paper cone, and the price is high enough that you hesitate, and then buy them anyway, because you've been walking and eating practical food all morning. And this is a treat, and treats cost more than practical food in every century, and the coins you are handing over for a small paper cone of sugar, coated spice seeds represent, in the most accurate sense, a transaction between what you need and what you want, with want winning narrowly. You eat the comfits walking away from the market, the crunch of sugar followed by the aromatic release of the seed inside, and you understand, standing on a medieval street in the middle of the afternoon, exactly what the medieval fair attendee or market visitor felt in the same moment. The small, genuine pleasure of something sweet and unnecessary, bought with discretionary coin, in a world that did not always generate much discretion, and not much coin. The world did not need to be comfortable to produce pleasure. It needed a woman with a brazier and some fat and a handful of spice seeds, and the knowledge of what to do with them. The medieval junk food industry, for all its violations and its dubious pies and its recycled frying fat, and its heavily spiced sausages of questionable origin, was a genuine creative achievement. The production of pleasure under conditions of scarcity, for people who needed it and could barely afford it, sustained by the basic human drive to eat something hot and good and ordinary, and to feel, for the duration of one pie or one bag of comfits, slightly better than the morning deserved. Let's go back to the beginning of the day, because the medieval street food economy started before you woke up. Long before the market opened, before the first customer appeared at any stall, the production side of the medieval fast food industry was already operating at full speed. The baker had been up since before midnight. The cookshop fire was going by 3 in the morning. The pie maker had her dough mixed and her filling prepared before dawn. By the time you arrived at the market hungry and looking for something to eat, the food you were going to buy had been hours in the making, produced through a night's labour that you never saw and wouldn't think to consider as you bit into the result. The medieval baker's day began in the dark, and not the romantic candlelit dark of nostalgic imagination, but the practical, functional dark of a working professional who had a long list of tasks to complete before the city woke up and started wanting bread. The oven needed to be preheated, which in a wood-fired oven meant building and burning a significant fire inside the oven chamber for several hours before the first loaf went in, bringing the oven walls up to the temperature needed for baking. You tested the oven temperature the way medieval bakers tested it, which was to throw a handful of flour inside and observe how quickly it browned, or to hold your hand near the opening and count how long before you had to pull it back. There were no thermometers. There was judgment, developed over years of building the same fire in the same oven and observing the same results. The baker who had been doing this for a decade could read his oven the way a sailor reads the sky. Not perfectly, but well enough. The bread that came out of this oven was shaped by who was buying it and how much they could pay. White bread, made from finely milled wheat flour with the brown sifted out, was the bread of people who could afford better. It was lighter, softer, and more palatable, and it cost more both because the fine milling was labour intensive and because the bran that was removed still had to go somewhere, meaning you were paying for the part you were eating and letting someone else have the part you weren't. Wastel bread was a good quality white bread commonly available in towns. The manchet was the premium individual roll. Coarser bread, made from less carefully milled flour, or from mixtures of wheat and rye or oats, was cheaper and darker and denser, and was what most urban workers ate most of the time. At the very bottom of the bread hierarchy was the maslin, or mixed grain bread, produced from whatever combination of grains was available and affordable, sometimes supplemented with dried peas or beans ground into the flour to extend the supply, and sometimes simply the leftover flour swept from the mill floor and sold at a discount. The bread made from this flour was dark, heavy, and kept reasonably well, which was its advantage. Denser bread lasted longer without going stale, which mattered in households where the bread might need to sustain people for several days. It was not delicious in any conventional sense. It was filling, and in a world where filling was the primary requirement, it was sufficient. The bread that was several days old, too stale to eat as bread, but not yet inedible, had a second career as the foundation of other foods. Stale bread was ground or soaked and used to thicken sauces and soups. It became the trencher that served as a plate. It went into the breadcrumb coating for fried foods, including some of the fritters we mentioned earlier. It was soaked in water or broth and heated into a porridge that was technically a meal if you were hungry enough not to be particular about the format. Nothing went to waste in the medieval food system, not because medieval people had a philosophical commitment to zero waste, but because every calorie had a cost and discarding edible material was simply expensive in a way that most households could not sustain. The vegetable seller at the market deserves more attention than she usually gets in accounts of medieval food, because vegetables were central to the medieval diet, in ways that the emphasis on meat in romantic accounts obscures. The vast majority of medieval people, the working people, the urban poor, the rural peasant, ate a diet that was predominantly plant, based not by choice but by necessity. Meat was expensive, vegetables were not. The market garden outside the city walls, the strips of allotment ground within the city where people grew what they could in whatever space was available, the wild plants gathered from hedgerows and common land. All of these fed the majority of the population with a diet that modern nutritionists would find remarkably vegetable, heavy, and would probably applaud, if they could ignore the lack of variety and the preparation methods. Root vegetables were the backbone: turnips, parsnips, carrots in the later medieval period, onions and leeks and garlic, which were grown everywhere and used in nearly every savoury preparation. Onions were possibly the most important vegetable in the medieval kitchen, cheap, available year, brown through storage, and capable of transforming the flavour of almost any other ingredient through cooking. The medieval onion, typically smaller and more pungent than its modern counterpart, was not a supporting player but a central ingredient, fried in fat as the base of pottage, raw in salads for those who like salads, roasted whole in the embers of the fire, and pickled in vinegar for preservation. An onion seller at the market was selling something that every household needed in quantity, and would run out of if not regularly replenished. The pea and bean seller was similarly central, because dried legumes were the primary protein source for people who couldn't afford regular meat. Dried peas and beans were cheap, kept for months in a sack, and provided the kind of substantial, filling nutrition that a working body needed to sustain a physical day. Cooked into pottage with onions and whatever else was available, they produced a meal that was more nutritious than it looked and more sustaining than its humble ingredients suggested. The quality of peas mattered. Fresh dried peas from the most recent harvest cooked quickly and tasted clean and slightly sweet. Old peas from the bottom of the storage jar took longer to cook and developed an earthier flavour that was harder to disguise. The experienced cook knew the difference and adjusted cooking time accordingly. The experienced buyer at the market could judge the age of dried peas by their appearance and smell in the same way that experienced buyers in any era develop the ability to assess ingredient quality through sensory evaluation rather than explicit testing. The herb sellers who set up at the edge of the market, or who moved through the streets with bunches of cut herbs in baskets, were selling something that was simultaneously culinary, medicinal, and cosmetic. Medieval herbs were not clearly divided into these categories. Mint was used in food and in remedies for stomach complaints and as a fragrance. Sage was used in cooking and to preserve meat and to treat various ailments. Rosemary was planted for cooking and for scent, and was burned at sick beds for its purifying properties. The herbalist who sold from the market stall was not a chef's supplier or a pharmacist, but both simultaneously, and the customer who bought a bunch of herbs from her might use them for several of these purposes, without distinguishing between them, because the medieval framework did not make these distinctions as sharply as ours does. The street food of the poor in the medieval city, the genuinely poor, the person with almost no money, was a study in the minimum viable meal. A handful of dried peas bought raw and eaten cold. The crusts of bread that the baker gave away at closing time rather than carry them home. The windfall apples gathered from the ground beneath the orchard trees that the owner had not gotten to. The scraps of fat and offal left over from the butcher's cutting block that could not be sold as anything else, and were given to whoever asked with the right combination of timing and persistence. The wild plants gathered from whatever uncultivated ground the city contained: chickweed, dandelion, sorrel, cresses from the damp ground near water. These were not supplementary foods. For the poorest urban residents, they were the diet, assembled daily from whatever combination of free or near free calories could be found in the city's margins. The contrast between this diet and the diet visible in the same markets on the same days was one of the sharpest inequalities in the medieval city. The wealthy merchant buying spices for his household's festive cooking, the guild officer purchasing the wine for the quarterly dinner, the housewife choosing the best cuts for the week. They were shopping in the same physical space as the person who was trying to spend a farthing on enough food to get through the day. And the gap between their experiences of that market, their relationship to the food available there, was as wide as any inequality in any modern city. and considerably more visible because everyone was in the same place, at the same time with their economic position displayed in what they were buying and how much they were handling the price before deciding. The cook's reputation. Let's talk about this, because it matters in a way that the court records of prosecutions don't fully capture. The cookshop operator in a medieval city lived or died by reputation in the most literal commercial sense. Their return customers were their income. And return customers came back because the food was good, or at least consistent, or at minimum, not obviously dangerous. The prosecution records from London and other medieval cities show egregious violations of food standards, but they also show, in the patterns of enforcement, that the same operators were prosecuted repeatedly and continued to operate, which suggests either that the penalties were insufficient deterrents, or that the market tolerated a certain level of violation while still supporting continued operation. Both of these things were probably true, but the majority of cookshop operators were not running serial violations. They were running businesses in difficult conditions with limited resources and strong economic incentives to maintain the quality of their product. The alewife, who had been in business for 20 years in the same neighbourhood, had 20 years of reputation invested in her enterprise. The pie maker, whose stall was at the same market corner every week, knew that the customers who came back week after week came back because they knew what to expect. The continuity of the medieval street food business, the same faces at the same stalls week after week through changing seasons and years, was sustained by reputation management in its most basic and direct form. You were good enough that people chose you again, or you were not, and they didn't. The apprentice and the street food system had a relationship that was commercially important for the street food vendors and practically important for the apprentices. Apprentices in medieval cities were typically young men, sometimes women, who had been placed with a master craftsman to learn a trade over a term of years ranging from 5 to 10, receiving training, lodging, and food in exchange for their labour. The food provided to apprentices by their masters was specified in apprenticeship contracts and was supposed to be adequate. In practice, it was frequently whatever the master thought was adequate, which in many cases was not quite the same thing. The apprentice who was inadequately fed at home, or who wanted variety, or who simply wanted to eat something other than the master's table, turned to the street food market as the supplement to an insufficient domestic provision. Apprentices were a significant portion of the street food customer base in any medieval city with a substantial craft sector, which meant most significant towns. They were young, they were hungry with the specific hunger of working bodies that are still growing. They had some discretionary coin from whatever small allowances or tips they received, and they were free to move through the city on errands in ways that gave them access to the market stalls and cookshops. The pie man at the market knew the apprentices by face and by the rhythm of their appearances. The fritter seller knew the ones who bought every week. The gingerbread at the fair was bought partly by adults with money and partly by apprentices who had saved for the occasion. This was the medieval economy of small desires, the treat you planned for, the purchase that represented the small discretionary spending of people whose spending was mostly not discretionary. The tournament. When a significant tournament came to a city or its immediate environs, the street food economy went into a particular kind of overdrive that was different in quality from the ordinary fare. Tournaments drew people from distances and in numbers that the ordinary market did not handle, and they drew them with money spent on travel and with the festive psychology of people who had come specifically for an event and were prepared to spend in ways their ordinary daily budgets did not permit. The food vendors who set up around a tournament ground were aware of this premium market and priced accordingly, and the range of products available extended upward from the ordinary street food into territory that the everyday market vendor would not usually attempt. Roasted meats on spits set up in the open air, the smoke visible from a distance, and the smell functional as advertising for a radius of several hundred feet. Wine sold from casks at prices that reflected the captive market and the festive occasion. Spiced cakes and wafers from the premium end of the sweet food spectrum, priced for people who had travelled some distance and were willing to spend something on the experience. And alongside the premium vendors, all the ordinary food vendors who had followed the crowd, the herring basket, the dried fig seller, the pie man, the hot pea stall, all the normal infrastructure of feeding people who had no kitchen with them. The tournament was a microcosm of the medieval food economy, concentrated in space and time. The whole range from the cheapest sustenance to the festive luxury, available within walking distance of each other, servicing a crowd that represented the same economic range in its composition. The role of fire in all of this deserves a moment of consideration, because the medieval street food system ran entirely on fire, and the management of fire was the central technical challenge of every vendor's operation. You needed fire hot enough to cook properly, controlled enough not to set the neighbouring stall or building alight, maintained through wind and rain and the varying quality of the fuel supply, and available in a context where the tools for fire management were minimal and the materials were variable. The open brazier, the simple iron pan set over a small fire, the portable grill of iron bars set over burning charcoal. These were the tools of the street food trade, and operating them safely and effectively while serving customers and managing the product, and keeping an eye on the fuel supply and the weather was a practical skill of real complexity. The fire that cooked the street food was also a real fire risk in cities built largely of timber and thatch. Medieval cities burned, not occasionally or accidentally in isolated incidents, but repeatedly, catastrophically, with a regularity that shaped the urban landscape and the urban consciousness in ways that are difficult to overstate if you have only ever lived in a city where fire is an expected event. London burned several times in the medieval period, the most famous conflagration being the Great Fire of 1666, but that disaster having many medieval predecessors. The cookshop, with its multiple fires burning continuously, was a recognised fire hazard, and the regulations around cookshop operation in medieval cities frequently addressed fire safety, where cookshops could operate, how their fires had to be managed, what materials could be used in their construction. The cookshop that burned down the neighbourhood behind it is not a hypothetical. It is a medieval court record. The water supply and the street food market were related in ways that were not always obvious, but were consistently important. Water was needed for cooking, for washing equipment, for mixing batter and dough, for the 1,000 practical uses of any food preparation operation. In a medieval city, water came from wells, from rivers or streams, from conduit systems in the larger towns that piped water from a source outside the city into public fountains. The quality of this water, as we've discussed in the context of the tavern, was variable and sometimes dangerous. The street food vendor who used the nearest water source for their cooking was importing whatever that water contained into their product, and the customer who ate the result was consuming whatever the vendor had used. This chain of causation was not understood in germ theory terms, but it was observed in outcome terms. Neighbourhoods with better water sources had better public health, and the people who worked in or near those neighbourhoods made empirical observations about this that informed their choices even without the theoretical framework to explain them. The medieval vegetable market in high summer was a different proposition from the winter version, and the difference was so dramatic that it constituted almost a different food landscape. In summer, the stalls carried things that were alive that morning: fresh peas still in their pods, broad beans in the shell, young cabbages with their outer leaves still green and intact, bunches of fresh herbs with their smell still strong, early root vegetables pulled small when they were tender rather than large when they were old. The summer market smelled of green things and earth and growing, a smell that was different from every other smell in the medieval city, and that represented, to anyone paying attention, the seasonal shift in what was possible and available. Eating in summer, if you had any money at all and access to a market, was different in quality from eating in winter. The strawberry seller in June was one of the most popular and most seasonal of all medieval market vendors, because strawberries in the medieval period were not the year-round commodity of the modern supermarket, but a brief and specific seasonal event, available for a few weeks in early summer and then gone until the following year. Medieval strawberries were smaller than their modern counterparts, closer to the wild strawberry, and intensely flavoured in the way that concentration produces, when a small fruit is allowed to ripen fully. They were sold fresh from baskets in the market, and by ambulatory vendors who moved through the streets calling their product in the traditional manner of street sellers. They were eaten as they are always eaten, immediately, over a short period, as much as possible before the season ends, because the season always ends, and it takes a full year to come back. The medieval strawberry season was both a pleasure and a reminder that pleasure was temporary, which is perhaps why Chaucer described a character eating strawberries at a feast as a specific note of seasonal abundance, rather than a routine dietary detail. The soup seller, operating from a large cauldron kept hot over a constant fire, was one of the most important figures in the medieval street food landscape, because soup was the most efficient delivery mechanism for hot liquid, filling food at the lowest possible price. A well-made pottage or soup stretched expensive ingredients across many portions in ways that no other cooking method equaled, diluting the cost of each ingredient across a larger quantity of final product and producing something that was genuinely nutritious, genuinely hot, and genuinely cheap. The soup you bought from the street vendor for a farthing might contain more nutritional value than the pie from the cookshop costing 4 times as much, because soup made from bones and dried peas and onions, and whatever else went in the pot that day was doing efficient work with cheap ingredients, in a way that the pie, with its expensive pastry shell and its modest filling, was not. The soup was eaten in a rented bowl, or not a rented bowl exactly, but the vendor's bowl returned when finished, washed in the bucket behind the stall, and handed to the next customer. The hygiene of this system was not nothing, but it was also not much. A bowl wiped between uses in cold water of uncertain cleanliness was not sterile. The customer who ate from a bowl previously used by a sick person was engaging in a transmission vector that germ theory would later identify, and that medieval people were aware of in outcome terms without the mechanistic understanding. The practice continued because the alternative, every customer bringing their own vessel, was impractical in the street food context, and because the transmission risk from communal bowls, while real, was outweighed in the everyday calculation by the need to eat. The spice merchant adjacent to the food market deserves acknowledgement, because the relationship between the spice trade and the medieval street food economy was real and direct. The spices that the cookshop used, however sparingly, came from the spice merchant, who sourced them from the wholesale spice trade that moved goods from the ports where they arrived from the eastern Mediterranean through the domestic distribution network to the inland market. The spice merchant was not merely selling flavouring. He was selling the end product of a global supply chain that involved Arab traders, Venetian merchants, alpine passes, riverboats, and the particular commercial infrastructure of every city the goods passed through. The nutmeg in the spiced wine, the ginger in the gingerbread, the cinnamon in the comfit. These were the final destination of journeys that had begun in places most medieval English people had never heard of and could not have placed on a map. The merchant himself understood this network, at least the portion of it that he operated in. He knew his suppliers in the port city. He knew the rough origin of his goods by reputation and by quality. He knew which spices were genuine and which were adulterated or mislabeled, because the adulteration of spices was a persistent problem in the medieval spice trade, with lesser materials mixed into or substituted for expensive ones at various points along the chain. Pepper mixed with dried juniper berries, saffron threads mixed with dried red flowers of other plants, ginger of varying quality and age sold at uniform prices. The spice merchant, who maintained his reputation for good quality goods, was worth more to his regular customers than a discount supplier of uncertain material, and the professional reputation of the spice trade was, like every professional reputation in the medieval period, an asset carefully maintained because it was genuinely valuable. The donut, if we can apply an anachronistic term to a medieval food that occupied the same niche with the same function, existed in several forms in the medieval street food landscape. The basic concept of a fried dough product was not invented in the medieval period, but was present in it. Dough, fat, fire, a round or twisted shape, and sometimes a sweet or spiced coating. Medieval fried doughs appeared under various names in various regions. Buillos in Spain, zeppel in Italy. Various unnamed fried pastries in England and France, that the recipe manuscripts describe, without giving them the specific identity that marketing would later assign. They were sold at fairs and markets. They were made at carnival time, before Lent began, and they occupied the same psychological space as the modern donut. Hot, slightly oily. Sweet if you could manage it, eaten fast because they were best hot, and consistently more appealing than your rational assessment of their nutritional value. The children eating street food in a medieval city present a picture that is both similar to and different from the modern child, with their pocket money at the corner shop. Medieval children from working families were part of the family economic unit, in a way that the modern child is not contributing labour from an early age and therefore sometimes having small amounts of coin of their own from tips, small tasks, and the minor economic transactions of the children's economy. These coins could and did go into the street food market. The gingerbread at the fair that was aimed partly at children was aimed at them specifically, the shapes moulded to figures and animals that were more appealing to a child than a plain rectangle of spiced paste. The penny pie that a child could buy and eat in 2 bites was within the financial range of a child, with a halfpenny saved from several days of odd jobs. But medieval childhood was also shorter and differently structured than its modern equivalent, and the child who appeared at the market was often there not to spend their own coin on treats, but to run an errand, to buy bread for the household or herbs for the kitchen, to collect a prepared dish from the cookshop that had been delivered there for communal baking. The child as an economic actor, performing real tasks for real purposes, rather than spending discretionary money on optional pleasures, was the dominant mode of child market interaction. The sweet purchased for pleasure was a supplement to this functional purpose, not the purpose itself. The child who successfully completed the errand and had a halfpenny to spend afterward on a fritter was experiencing exactly the same structure of reward. Following work that adults in any century recognize as one of the genuine pleasures of earning. The evening, the street food market did not stop at the same time as the day market. In a medieval city where artificial light was expensive and movement after dark was regulated by curfew, but not entirely prevented, there was a secondary food economy operating in the evening hours that served the specific population of people who were out after the market closed, tavern patrons looking for food to accompany their ale, workers whose shifts ended late, travellers who arrived in the city after the market was done, and the various categories of people who operated in the evening city for purposes that were not always officially sanctioned, but that consistently generated hunger. The hot food vendor in the evening was a more limited version of the daytime market presence, a cook shop that stayed open later than the general market, a pie man making a final round with whatever was left of his stock at the end of the day. The pie at the end of the day was not the pie of the morning. It was the pie that had been sitting in the warmth of the cook shop for several hours, its pastry softened and its filling concentrated, sold at whatever price the vendor needed to clear, rather than the full market price of the fresh morning pie. This was both a problem and an opportunity. The evening pie was lower quality, but cheaper, and for the customer who had very little coin and needed something before they slept, the cheap and slightly tired pie was better than nothing, which was the only available alternative. The relationship between the street food market and the food supply chain behind it is worth tracing, because the simple transaction of buying a pie at a market stall represents the final stage of a process that involved farmers, millers, butchers, fishermen, preservers, transporters, and wholesale traders before the pie maker ever got the ingredients. The wheat in the pastry came from a farm outside the city, was milled at a mill that took a portion of the flour as payment, was transported into the city on a cart, or by pack animal, was purchased by the baker or the pie maker from the grain merchant at the market, and was then processed by the cook into a product that was sold to you for a halfpenny. Every step of this chain involved a transaction and a margin, and the final price of the pie reflected the accumulated costs of the entire supply chain, compressed into the smallest coin that still represented a real exchange. When the supply chain was disrupted, the street food market felt it immediately. A bad harvest drove up the price of grain, which drove up the price of bread, which reduced the purchasing power of the people who bought bread, which reduced their ability to spend on other things, including street food. A failure of the herring fishery drove up the price of fish, which affected the Lenten menu across the entire cookshop sector. A cattle plague reduced the supply of beef, and consequently the supply of the byproducts that went into cheap pies. The street food economy was not insulated from agricultural and environmental shocks. It was downstream of them, and the people who worked in it and depended on it were among the first to feel the price signals that a supply disruption produced. Let's think about the vendor herself, the woman behind the fritter pan, or the basket of gingerbread, for a moment, because her economic life was precarious in ways that the transaction of buying a fritter doesn't make visible. She had invested in her equipment, the pan, the brazier, the fuel supply, the stock of ingredients. She had paid for her market pitch, because market spaces in medieval towns were allocated and charged for, with the better pitches commanding higher fees and the desirable positions near the market cross, or the main entry points going to established vendors with years of priority claim. She was working in a competitive environment where multiple vendors were selling similar products at similar prices, and where the difference between a profitable day and a even day was often the weather, the size of the crowd, and whether anything else was happening in the town that drew or repelled the customers she needed. On a good market day, the sun out, a fair in town, a saint's day bringing extra people to the market, she might sell her entire stock and finish with enough profit to cover her costs, pay her pitch fee, and have something left over. On a bad market day, the rain coming, the market thin, the competing vendor 2 stalls down with better stock or lower prices, she might sell half her stock and have to carry the rest home and decide what to do with it. The fritter batter that wasn't used today could be used tomorrow if kept in the cold. The gingerbread kept indefinitely. The fresh fruit for the fritter filling did not. Every day's trading involved a calculation about what was likely to sell and what would have to be written off, made under conditions of uncertainty because neither the weather nor the customer count was predictable in advance. Her income was not steady. Her expenses were partly fixed, the pitch fee, the fuel, the equipment maintenance, and partly variable with volume, the ingredient costs, scaling with production. The margin between what she paid for ingredients and what she sold the finished product for was thin, constrained by what customers would pay and by what the competition was charging. She knew her costs precisely because she had to overcosting. In any component threatened the margin that sustained her operation. She knew her customers by type, the ones who would pay the full price without negotiating, and the ones who would try to negotiate, the ones who bought every week, and the occasional visitor who might pay slightly more because they didn't know the normal price. She managed all of this knowledge continuously, updating it with each transaction, because the information was her competitive advantage in a market where all the products were similar, and the vendor was the differentiating factor. This is the medieval junk food economy in its full human complexity. Not just a collection of interesting historical snacks, but an economic system involving hundreds of thousands of people across medieval Europe, running on thin margins and precarious supply chains, producing real food for real hungry people under real constraints, and doing it every day across the centuries with the kind of persistence that requires both genuine skill and genuine necessity as motivations. The apple fritter you bought this morning, hot from the pan, crispy and sweet, tasting of nothing more complicated than fried batter and soft apple and whatever fragment of spice the vendor could afford. That fritter represents the final output of this entire system, landing in your hand at the intersection of everything that made it possible. That was just the market day. Wait until you hear about the royal feast, where the sugar work alone cost more than a labourer earned in a year, and where the gap between what the rich ate and what you just ate becomes so wide that it starts to feel like different species with different relationships to the concept of food entirely. But that is a story for another evening. For now, the market is closing. The fritter seller is putting out her fire. The pie man has sold his last pie and is carrying his empty basket home. The gingerbread stall is packed down into its cart. The smells are fading, the smoke clearing slightly in the late afternoon air, and the street is returning to the ordinary sounds of a city at the end of its working day. Let's go somewhere else for a moment. Italy. Specifically Florence or Venice in the 14th century, because the Italian city was the most sophisticated food environment in medieval Europe, and its street food culture was correspondingly more elaborate than anything available in London or Paris. The Italian cookshop, the Bottega del Cuoco or the Frigatoria, was operating in a context of considerably greater ingredient availability, more sophisticated cooking technique, and a customer base with higher average income and more developed food expectations than its northern equivalents. The street food of a 14th century Italian city was not different in kind from what we've been describing. It was different in degree. The ingredients were better, the technique was more refined, the range was wider, and the price, correspondingly, was higher for the premium end, while the cheap end remained cheap enough for the poor. The Frigatoria, the frying shop that specialized in fried foods, was a fixture of Italian medieval cities. In a way it wasn't quite in northern Europe, and it produced a range of fried products that went beyond the apple fritter to encompass fried vegetables, fried fish, fried cheese, fried dough in various shapes, and fried savoury pastries that were the ancestors of the arancini and the panzerotti that survive in various forms in Italian food today. The olive oil available in an Italian city, though expensive, produced a cleaner and lighter fried product than the northern lard, and the Mediterranean vegetable supply gave the Italian fritter maker a much wider range of things to fry. An artichoke fried in olive oil, slices of eggplant, sage leaves in batter. These were Italian street foods that would not appear in an English market for centuries, and some of which still haven't fully arrived. The pasta seller in a late medieval Italian city is a figure worth pausing on because pasta in the medieval period was already a significant food industry in Italy, though the pasta of the 14th century was not quite what you might expect. Fresh pasta made from eggs and flour was one thing, and it existed and was eaten. Dried pasta made from hard wheat semolina and dried for long storage was a separate and separately significant product that was being produced in Sicily and Liguria by the 13th century in quantities large enough to be traded commercially. The dried pasta was cooked in broth, served with cheese, and eaten on the street or at home, or in the tavern in ways that made it already a convenience food in the modern sense, shelf-stable, quick to prepare relative to most medieval cooking, and available to the street vendor who wanted to offer a hot cooked dish without the infrastructure of a full kitchen. The Venetian street food landscape was organised in part around the city's physical structure, the canals and bridges and narrow streets, and the specific traffic patterns of a city that moved by boat as much as by foot. The fishmonger's boat tied up at a canal landing sold fresh fish directly to the population that gathered there in the morning. The bakery with its oven opening onto the street sold bread fresh, at hours calibrated to the appetite of the neighbourhood. The vendor who navigated the smaller canals by boat, calling his product and selling from the vessel to the inhabitants of the Palatian tenements that lined the water, was a delivery system as much as a market stall, bringing the market to people who couldn't always get to it. Venice produced, from this particular geography, a street food culture that was simultaneously the most sophisticated and the most water, adjacent in medieval Europe, organised around fish and seafood in ways that landlocked cities could not match. The fish sold on Venetian streets included things the English visitor would find both recognisable and completely strange. Bacol, salt cod prepared in the Venetian manner with olive oil and spices, was one of the most important street foods in the city, sold from the counters of the bacar that were the equivalent of the English cookshop for fish preparation. The preparation of salt cod into a palatable and even excellent food was a skill that required both knowledge and time, and the professional who did it well was offering something that the home cook, with a block of dried stockfish and no previous experience, would struggle to replicate. Cuttlefish cooked in their own ink, producing the dramatic black sauce that is still a Venetian specialty, appeared on the street food market in a form accessible to people who could not produce it at home because they did not have the technique or the patience. Small crabs, raw shellfish, the seasonal abundance of the lagoon, all of these appeared on the Venetian street food market in ways that were possible because Venice sat in a lagoon full of seafood, and that were commercially significant because the city's large population needed to eat. Back in England, the peas pudding sold on the streets of London by the 14th century was a food of such persistent usefulness and widespread consumption that it is still being made, and still being sold in its traditional strongholds in the northeast of England in a form recognisably descended from its medieval ancestor. Peas pudding is simply dried peas, soaked and cooked until completely soft, and then either served as a thick paste or tied in a cloth and boiled, producing a firm sliceable round of pea protein that can be served hot or cold, with or without seasoning, as a side dish or as a primary food. Hot peas pudding sold from a pot on the street was cheap, nutritious, portable if wrapped in a leaf or cloth, and about as simple as a food could be without ceasing to be a food in any meaningful sense. It was not exciting, it was sustaining. The distinction between these two things was more important in the medieval period than it is now, because sustaining was the primary requirement, and exciting was a luxury most people encountered only occasionally. The pigment of the medieval food street, if we're going to think about it visually, was the spit roast. The whole animal, or the large joint turning slowly over the fire on a spit that was rotated by a small boy, or by a mechanical device, or simply by the periodic attention of whoever was available, producing the progressive caramelization of the exterior, and the slow rendering of the fat, and the specific smell of roasting meat that was the most expensive and most desired smell in the medieval food landscape. The roast was not available to most people most of the time. It required a large piece of meat, a spit, a fire of sufficient duration, and someone to manage all of this for the several hours that roasting took. The cook shop that ran a spit was offering something that domestic cooking could not provide in most households, and it charged accordingly. The spit, roasted meat sold by the portion at a cook shop, was priced above the pie, but below the whole joint, sliced off the roast as needed, and wrapped in bread, or served on a trencher, depending on the establishment's level of service. It was genuinely excellent food when fresh from the spit, the exterior crispy and seasoned by the fire, the interior moist and full of the flavour that long, slow roasting produces. It was considerably less excellent after it had been sitting off the spit for an hour, while the next joint finished, the exterior softening and the interior cooling, and the magical quality of perfectly roasted meat quietly departing. The cookshop owner who managed the timing of the spit well, who was serving at the right moment, maintained a reputation for good roast. The one who sold you yesterday's reheated portion at today's fresh price was operating in the tradition of food service that has not fundamentally changed in 7 centuries. The cook himself, the professional cook working in the serious establishments, was a skilled tradesperson who occupied an interesting position in medieval social hierarchy. Cooking was recognized as a craft requiring genuine skill, and the master cook of a great household was a figure of real professional status. who commanded significant pay and significant deference within the household hierarchy. But cooking was also service work done for others, and service work in the medieval framework carried social implications that modified the status of the skilled practitioner in ways that did not apply to craft workers who produced goods rather than services. The cooked for you. The smith made something for you. These seemed like different relationships in the medieval social understanding, and the smith occupied a more consistently respectable social position, despite the cook's possibly superior technical knowledge. The question of what medieval people thought about their food, as opposed to what they ate, is harder to answer than it seems, because the surviving evidence is heavily weighted toward the upper end of the social spectrum. The recipe manuscripts document what the wealthy ate. The church sermons document what the poor should not have been eating. The court records document what the food vendors were doing wrong. What we have much less of is the unmediated voice of ordinary people, talking about food in terms of pleasure, preference, and desire. We can infer some of it. The repeat visits to particular stalls suggest preference. The specific prosecutions of vendors for selling things the regulations prohibited suggest that demand for those things existed. The poetry that mentions specific foods with evident relish suggests that medieval people found eating pleasurable in ways that went beyond mere sustenance. Chaucer's partner talks about the sin of gluttony with a specificity and a relish that suggests intimate familiarity. The miller of his Canterbury tales is described with a love of strong food and drink that is presented as part of his character, a physical appetite that matches his physical presence. The cook in the same work is described in terms that include an ulcerous sore on his shin, a detail that Chaucer includes with the deliberate grotesque humour of a man who understood that the cook's professional relationship to food was complicated by proximity to the realities of food production that the customer preferred not to think about. These are literary observations, filtered through the intention of a skilled writer, but they reflect a culture that thought about food, that had opinions about it, that found it both pleasurable and morally complicated in ways that produced a rich literary tradition of food discourse, centuries before food became a topic of public cultural conversation in the modern sense. The vinegar and verjuice sellers at the market were selling condiments that functioned both as flavour enhancers and as food safety, measures in the context of medieval street food. Vinegar, produced from wine or ale that had continued to ferment past the alcohol phase into acetic acid, was used as a preservative, a dressing, and a sauce element. Verjuice, the sharp juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, served similar purposes in cooking and condiment preparation. Both were cheap enough to be widely available, and sharp enough to transform the flavour of preserved fish, old bread, and various other foods that needed something acidic to compensate for the passage of time. The mustard we mentioned was mixed with verjuice for exactly this reason. The sharp, acid, fresh tasting quality of vinegar or verjuice against the salt, heavy, fat, heavy food of the medieval street was a flavour pairing that worked as well then as acidity works against richness in any culinary tradition. The medieval food market in autumn deserves special attention, because autumn was the season of abundance in a way that no other season matched. The harvest gathered, the stores full, the animals slaughtered and preserved before winter, and the specific foods of autumn available in quantities not seen at other times of year. The apple harvest filled the orchards, and then the baskets at the market, the apples ranging from the tiny wild crabs to the larger cultivated varieties that the monasteries and great estates had developed through centuries of selection. Nuts came in, walnuts, hazelnuts, the chestnuts we mentioned, all of them at their peak of freshness in October, and available in quantities that turned the nut vendor from an occasional presence into a significant market fixture. The last of the fresh vegetables before winter storage began, pumpkins and squash, in the later medieval period, as these New World foods gradually arrived, cabbages and kale and root vegetables, in large quantities, while they were still fresh rather than stored. The autumn pig slaughter was one of the most significant food events in the medieval calendar, the point at which the pigs that had been fed on summer foraging and harvest scraps were killed and processed before winter, producing meat and fat and offal in quantities that triggered a burst of preservation activity and a brief period of eating fresh pork in ways not otherwise available during the year. The autumn cookshop had fresh pork in a way that the spring cookshop did not, and the autumn sausage had a freshness and quality that the winter version, made from preserved meat, could not match. The autumn fair, held in many towns to coincide with the harvest completion, was the peak food event of the year. The greatest variety of fresh food, the most abundant supply of preserved food. the greatest concentration of vendor activity, and the customer base at its most expansive, because the harvest had determined whether people had discretionary money to spend. And in a good year, the answer was yes. The smell of the autumn market is the smell that medieval people would recognize as abundance. New, pressed apple juice, fermenting gently in barrels, fresh bread from the harvest wheat, roasting chestnuts from the first charcoal braziers of the cooling season, the specific warm smell of freshly preserved meats, the yeast and sweetness of new ale made from the autumn grain. This was the smell of the year turning in the right direction, of stores being filled, of the calculation between what was gathered and what was needed tipping, for once toward enough. Medieval people recognized it and responded to it with the relief and pleasure of people who had spent the summer uncertain whether autumn would be adequate and were now finding that it was. The market in a good harvest year was a different place from the market in a bad one, and the difference was not just economic but emotional, a collective exhale of a community that had made it through another year. The herbs on the market stall had a smell of their own that cut through everything else. The sharp green smell of fresh rosemary, the soft sweetness of basil in summer, the warm earthiness of dried thyme, the particular medicinal culinary ambiguity of sage. The herb seller's stall was one of the most aromatic corners of the market, and one of the most frequented, because herbs were the primary flavouring technology available to cooks, who could not afford spices, and the primary medicinal technology available to people who could not afford a physician, and these two uses overlapped in ways that made the herb stall the medieval equivalent of both the spice shop and the pharmacy, serving both purposes with the same bunches of greenery and the same practical knowledge of what each plant was supposed to do. The candied orange peel, if we want to trace the ancestry of modern confectionery one more step, appears in the late medieval period as one of the more interesting luxury sweet foods available at the premium end of the market. Citrus fruits reached northern Europe from the Mediterranean through trade, and while fresh oranges and lemons were rare and expensive, the preserved products made from them, the dried peel, the candied peel, the conserves of shuckus with sugar, were available at high-end markets and at the luxury end of the fair food supply. Candied orange peel was the medieval confection that most clearly foreshadowed the modern confectionery industry, sweet, aromatic, preserved, portable, and selling at a price point that marked it as a treat rather than a necessity. The person who bought it knew they were spending more than they had to, and did it anyway, because the combination of citrus and sugar was worth the extra coin, the pleasure being real and immediate, and specific in a way that justifies occasional expenditure, even in economies where ordinary purchasing decisions are made very carefully. Let's end where we started, at the market, because the market is where it all comes together. You have been walking through this medieval food landscape for a long time now, past the cook shop and the fritter seller and the gingerbread at the fair stall and the comfit vendor and the herring basket and the hot pea pot and the pie man and the wayfarer and the autumn chestnut, brazier and the spring straw, the berry basket and the autumn apple pile, and what you have seen is not primitive food culture or backward practice or the eating habits of people who didn't know any better. What you have seen is a sophisticated, adaptive, economically integrated food system that served the needs of several million urban people across several centuries with the resources available to it, producing genuine pleasure and genuine nutrition in a context of genuine scarcity. The apple fritter that was the best thing on the street this morning was the best thing on the street because someone had developed the technique of making it well over years of practice, had sourced apples that were tart enough to stand up to the sweetness of the batter, had managed the frying fat carefully enough to produce a clean result, and had sold it at a price that allowed both the transaction and the return visit. That is not primitive. That is craft, applied to the intersection of constraint and desire, producing pleasure under conditions that made pleasure difficult, which is what all good cooking is in any century. You are back at the market entrance now, the day done around you. The vendors are breaking down their stalls. The unsold stock is being packed for tomorrow or evaluated for what it can still become. The braziers are being doused, the fire carefully managed, because a brazier tipped over on the way home is a hazard that nobody needs. The street is taking on the end of day smell, the accumulated food smells of the market day mixing with the cooling air of the late afternoon. The sharp top notes already fading, the base notes, smoke and fat, and the particular earthiness of a day's trading settling into the street surface and the nearby walls. Tomorrow it will be different. Tomorrow the stock will be fresh, and the fires will be new, and the first customers will arrive with morning hunger, and the whole sequence will begin again. But tonight the market is closing, and the vendors are going home, and you are standing at the edge of it all with a paper cone of the last of someone's comfits, eating the remaining ones one at a time in the specific way of someone making a small pleasure last as long as it reasonably can. Before you leave entirely, there is one more corner worth visiting. At the place where the market street meets the road to the river, a man is selling hypocras, or a version of hypocras. Hypocras is technically a spiced wine associated with noble tables and court medicine, the kind of drink mentioned in courtly poems alongside roasted peacock and sugar subtleties made by a confectioner who charged by the hour. What this man is selling is a cup of warm wine with spices in it, and he is calling it hypocras because that name carries associations his product can borrow without technically lying. The wine is not the best wine. The spices are the cheaper spices, the ones the upmarket spice traders would not touch. But it is warm, sweetened with a small amount of honey, and the spice smell coming off the cup is genuinely pleasant. On a cold afternoon in October, when the light is already going, and your hands are cold from carrying your purchases, a cup of warm spiced wine that costs 2 farthings is one of the better transactions available to you on this street. This is something the medieval period understood and the modern period keeps relearning. Cold weather and warm drinks are a market. The intersection of physical discomfort and an affordable remedy produces a commercial opportunity, so reliable that it has existed in every human society that has ever had to deal with cold weather, which is most of them. The hypocrite seller is not inventing anything. He is positioning himself at a corner where cold people pass, offering a solution to cold, and charging what the cold will bear. Stripped of the medieval vocabulary, this is a hot drink store, and hot drink stalls are so economically durable that they will survive into a future so distant from this market that the hypocrite seller would find it entirely unrecognizable. Selling beverages he has never heard of in materials he has never seen, but maintaining the essential proposition unchanged. You are cold. Here is warmth. Here is the price. You take a cup. You hold it with both hands. The warmth moves through your palms immediately, the way warmth from a cup always does. The specific pleasure of held heat that has been a pleasure for as long as cups have existed. The spice smell rises with the steam, cinnamon, and something that might be ginger, and something else you cannot identify with certainty. But that smells correct, the way a spiced drink is supposed to smell, the way that smell connects to every other spiced drink you have ever encountered, and tells you before you taste it that the experience is going to meet expectations. It meets expectations. It is warm. It is sweet enough to balance the wine's edge. The spices are present in the right way, background warmth rather than foreground aggression. You finish it before you reach the next intersection, which is how a good hot drink in cold weather is always finished, and you find yourself wishing, briefly, that you had bought 2. The spice trade that made that cup possible is a story so large that it has its own weight of history, and the short version is this. In the medieval period, spices came from places that most Europeans had never been and could barely conceptualize. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from India, nutmeg from islands in the Indonesian archipelago, so remote that the people who grew the nutmeg had never met a European. These goods travelled overland routes so long and so uncertain that the price at the end bore almost no relationship to the price at the beginning. Every intermediary on the route extracted their share. Every transfer of custody added cost. By the time a sack of pepper arrived at a market in London or Paris or Cologne, it had passed through enough hands that the original farmer would not have recognized the number attached to it, and probably would not have believed it. This meant that spices were expensive. Not expensive the way a nice bottle of wine is expensive, where you notice the price and decide it is worth it or not. Expensive in the way that changes what you eat and how you eat it, and what your eating says about you. A household that used pepper regularly was advertising something about its position in the world. A household that used saffron was advertising something even more specific, because saffron is labour, intensive to harvest even in its home climate, and even more expensive to transport. And a dish seasoned with saffron was a dish that cost more proportion than many households spent on food in a day. The spice chest in a wealthy medieval household was kept locked, not because spices posed a security risk the way a chest of coins does, but because they were, in terms of their cost, to volume ratio, roughly equivalent to a chest of coins, and were treated accordingly. The hypocrite seller's spices were not those spices. He was operating at the low end of a market that the high end barely recognized as connected to it. But the high end and the low end shared the same vocabulary, the same set of flavor references, the same cultural associations. When you drank his cup of warm wine, you were drinking something that pointed distantly and cheaply toward the same pleasures that the wealthy experience daily. This is what affordable street food often does. It does not replicate luxury. It creates a version of luxury that is accessible at the scale that is possible, and it borrows the cultural resonance of the original to make that version feel like participation rather than deprivation. Which sounds generous until you realise the version you got was reused wine and yesterday's cinnamon. But it was warm. On a cold afternoon in October, it counted. The bread is worth considering separately, because bread is where the medieval city's regulatory seriousness is most visible. The assize of bread was real law, seriously enforced, setting the weight that a loaf of a given price must meet, adjusted regularly to account for grain prices, giving the authorities the power to prosecute bakers who short-weighted their loaves. The punishment for repeated violation was the hurdle. The baker was tied to a hurdle and dragged through the market streets, the short-weight loaf tied around his neck, so that the entire market could observe the consequence of cheating the bread standard. This happened. It was not a theoretical punishment. The bread fraud records that survive show it was applied often enough that bakers in a given city knew it was a real risk, which suggests the regulatory framework was actually working, which means the bread you bought at this market was within the tolerance of the monitoring system, the weight you paid for. Consumer protection in 1350, officially in the form of a man being dragged through the street with a loaf tied to his neck. Unofficially, it worked. The market supervisors who moved through markets like this one, checking weights and measures, inspecting the condition of the meat, verifying that the fish being sold as fresh had not been stored somewhere it should not have been stored, were not purely decorative. The courts that heard food fraud cases issued real judgments, with real consequences. The fines were real. The reputational damage in a community where your customers all knew each other, and the gossip network operated at walking speed, was real. A vendor caught adulterating their product did not simply pay a fine and continue. They had to go back to the market the next day and face the people who had watched the supervisor find them out, which is a social cost that makes a fine look manageable by comparison. Translation: medieval food enforcement was genuinely functional, in ways that do not fit the standard narrative of universal medieval lawlessness. The ale wife at the end of the market street, who has been selling ale since the middle of the morning, is operating inside this framework. She knows what the standard measure is. She knows what the market supervisor looks like, and which days he tends to come through. She knows that the fine for short measure is significant, and that the reputational damage of being found out in a market where her customers all know each other is worse than the fine. She is not operating on trust and community norms in a romantic pre-commercial way. She is operating inside a system of enforcement that has enough teeth to make compliance the rational strategy, which is, in the end, how regulatory systems work when they work. You pass her stall on the way out. She is refilling a pot from a barrel in the back of her stall, the ale catching the late afternoon light, in a way that makes it look better than it probably is. She has been here since before you arrived, and she will be here until the light goes completely. She has spoken to hundreds of people today, measured out hundreds of cups, made hundreds of small transactions, absorbed dozens of complaints about last week's batch, having an off note, defended her pricing against 3 customers who were constitutionally required to negotiate anyway, and watched the market move through its full daily cycle from the perspective of someone who has not left her station in approximately 6 hours. When she finally closes up and carries her equipment home, she will have completed a full day's work that was economically essential to this neighbourhood, personally exhausting, socially central, and almost entirely invisible in the historical record, because the historical record of this period was written by people who did not spend their days measuring ale into cups at the edge of a market. This is true of almost everyone you have encountered today. The pie man, the fritter seller, the gingerbread woman, the sausage vendor, the chestnut seller, the baker's apprentice delivering the morning bread. They are present in the historical record as types, as category entries, as subjects of regulatory documents and occasional court cases, but not as individuals with names and particular histories and specific techniques developed over years of practice. The historical record is much better at preserving the experiences of people who generated documents than the experiences of people who generated street food. The street food is gone. The smell is gone. The specific techniques are gone. Reconstructible, only approximately from recipe books, aimed at a different level of the food system, and from regulatory records that described violations rather than standard practice. What is not gone is the basic human situation. You have been hungry in a city. Someone has been there with something to eat, at a price you could pay, in a form that could be consumed while standing. The transaction has taken place. You have eaten. The vendor has made the margin that keeps the operation running. The food was good enough to make you glad you stopped, which is a lower bar than a restaurant review and a higher bar than it sounds. These transactions, in their millions and over their centuries, constitute the real food history of the medieval period. The history that lived in the mouths and the hands and the daily experience of people who did not leave written records, but who did leave in the structure of the markets and the names of the guilds and the specifics of the regulatory documents. Enough traces to reconstruct the outline of what they ate, and how it tasted, and what it cost, and who made it. The shadows are long across the market square. Now the kind of shadows that appear only in the last 40 minutes of daylight in autumn, when the sun is low enough that even short things cast shadows you could count steps across. A dog is working the edges of the square methodically, checking each location where something was dropped or spilled, conducting its own audit of the day's edible residue with the professional thoroughness of someone who has done this every day and knows where the best locations are. The paving stones near where the fritter cellar was standing are darker than the surrounding stones, darkened by accumulated fat over years of frying in the same spot. A permanent record of the location of pleasure that will outlast the fritter cellar and her cart and her recipe and every memory of her particular version of the fritter by a very long margin. That stain on the pavement is, in its way, as good a historical document as anything written down. It says, here people ate. Here someone provided something worth eating. Here a transaction took place often enough and long enough that it left a physical trace. The food history of the medieval period is not only in the manuscripts and the court records and the guild regulations. It is also in the kitchen middens and the carbonized seeds and the isotope ratios in the bones and the fat stains on the pavement and the shape of the ovens cut into the walls of the buildings and the names of the streets that still, in some cities, preserve the name of the trade that was once conducted there. Bread Street, Milk Street, Poultry, Friday Street, where the fish sellers concentrated on the day that was, for religious reasons, the fish sellers' best day of the week. The city is speaking its food history through its geography, and most of the people moving through it every day are not listening, because they have somewhere to be and the message is written in a language that requires patience and a certain kind of attention to read. You have been paying that kind of attention today. You have been a particular kind of visitor to this market, one who arrived not just to buy things, but to understand the system within which the buying was happening, the economics and the regulations and the social structures, and the specific pleasures and the specific constraints. It has taken most of the day. It has been worth the day. One thing the food has told you, if you have been listening to it the right way, is something about the nature of pleasure under constraint. Every item you have encountered today represents a solution to a problem. The problem is always some version of people are hungry, they have limited money, they have no cooking facilities, and they are in a city where the nearest field is a significant walk away. The solution is always some version of, here is something edible, hot or preserved or portable enough to be useful, priced at what the problem will bear. But the solutions are not purely functional. The apple fritter is not nutritionally necessary. The gingerbread is not nutritionally necessary. The comfits are certainly not nutritionally necessary. These are pleasures deliberately constructed to be pleasures. And the people who constructed them and the people who bought them both knew that pleasure was what the transaction was for. The medieval street food vendor was not just solving a logistical problem. They were, in a very real sense, in the business of happiness, small happiness, affordable happiness, the kind that lasts for the duration of a fritter and costs what a labourer earns in a quarter hour, but happiness nonetheless. This is worth holding on to, because the standard narrative of medieval life does not leave much room for happiness of this kind. The standard narrative has plague and famine and arbitrary violence, and the constant proximity of death, and the theological weight of sin and damnation pressing down on everything. All of that was real. It was also not the whole story. The whole story includes a man selling warm spiced wine at a street corner, because people are cold, and warmth is pleasant. It includes a woman who has spent 20 years perfecting her fritter batter, and who takes genuine satisfaction in the fact that her version is better than the other woman's version. 3 stalls down. It includes a child eating a piece of gingerbread cut from a mould in the shape of a knight, holding it carefully, because it is a treat, and treats are not to be rushed. It includes an apprentice with a penny and a free half-hour, making the calculation between the pieman's offering and the sausage sellers and the herring basket, and deciding after genuine deliberation that today is a fritter day. These are human moments, recognizable across the centuries as human moments. and the food is where they happen. The street food of the medieval period is a window into those moments in a way that the official records are not. The official records preserve the transactions that went wrong, the fraud, the short wait, the adulterated sausage, the baker dragged through the market on a hurdle. The food itself, when you can reconstruct it, preserves the transactions that went right, the flavors that worked, the techniques that were refined, the pleasures that were delivered on the terms of the transaction. When you eat a properly made apple fritter today, which you can do, the recipe being entirely reconstructible from the evidence that survives, you are eating something genuinely continuous with what was sold at this market. The apple is the same apple. The batter technique is the same technique. The fat management is the same fat management. The pleasure is the same pleasure. The gap across the centuries closes briefly around a piece of fried food, which is perhaps not the most elevated way for that gap to close, but is arguably the most honest. There is also the question of what all this food meant socially, beyond the immediate transaction. The market was not just an economic space. It was the primary social space of the urban medieval world. The place where you encountered your neighbours and your rivals and your creditors, and the person you owed a favour to, and the person who owed you one. Where information travelled at the speed of conversation. And the speed of conversation was the fastest information travelled. The food was woven into this social fabric in ways that went beyond simple nourishment. Buying from a particular vendor was a social act as well as a commercial one. Choosing the pie man over the sausage seller was, in part, a statement about the relationship you had with each of them, and the relationship you wanted to maintain. Standing at the hot pea pot was a statement about what kind of person you were in terms of resources, not destitute, since you had a coin, but working within limits, since the peas were the most economical option. The market read you through what you bought and from whom, and you read it in return, and the food was the medium through which the reading happened. This is why the guild system mattered beyond its economic function. The guilds that governed the bakers, the butchers, the fishmongers, the cooks, the confectioners were not just trade associations managing competition and setting standards. They were the institutional expression of a moral framework that governed the relationship between the vendor and the customer and the community. The baker, who short-weighted his bread, was not just committing a commercial fraud. He was violating a relationship of trust that was understood to extend beyond the individual transaction into the fabric of communal life. The punishment was public because the offence was public, a violation not just of a regulation, but of the social contract that made the market possible. The market worked because enough of the people operating in it were operating in good faith enough of the time, and the institutions existed to address the cases when they were not, and the balance between the two was what produced, over the centuries, a functioning food system that fed a continent. That was just the market day. Wait until you hear about the royal feast, where the sugar work alone cost more than a labourer earned in a year, and where the gap between what the rich ate and what you just ate becomes so wide that it starts to feel like different species with different relationships to the concept of food entirely. But that is a story for another evening. For now, the market is closing. The fritter seller is putting out her fire. The pie man has sold his last pie and is carrying his empty basket home. The gingerbread stall is packed down into its cart. The smells are fading, the smoke clearing slightly in the late afternoon air, and the street is returning to the ordinary sounds of a city at the end of its working day. Dim, the lights. Sleep. Well, tomorrow, the market opens again.